Come alone, do not tell your husband, see the footage before it is deleted. Those 9 printed words on heavy parchment made the porcelain mug slip from my fingers and shatter across the floorboards. The unmarked envelope had arrived between a mundane electricity bill and a glossy landscaping brochure, bearing my name in cold black block capitals. Attached to the card was a sleek USB drive, along with a heavy brass key numbered 04. Julian had kissed my forehead that very morning before leaving for what he claimed was an emergency corporate restructuring meeting in Edinburgh. Yet when I inserted the drive into my laptop, the flickering video displayed a dimly lit private suite inside the Obsidian Gable dining club, just 10 miles down the road. There sat my husband of 14 years, leaning over a spread of legal deeds bearing my late father's signature, while my younger sister Clara gently rested her hand over his. The camera caught the exact moment Julian raised his glass toward the lens, with a faint dismissive smirk that transformed the man I loved into an absolute stranger. My phone vibrated against the wooden table with a single message from an unknown number, warning me that they were meeting again tonight, at 9, to sign away my entire life. The morning sun filtered through the high arched windows of our Surrey home, casting long geometric shadows across the pristine granite kitchen islands that Julian had insisted on installing during our last major renovation. To anyone looking in from the manicured lawns outside, we were the picture of suburban success, a quiet testament to 14 years of steady devotion and carefully managed prosperity. Julian was the brilliant senior partner at a respected private wealth firm in the city, while I had willingly stepped back from my own career in commercial law to manage our estate and care for our daughter Beatrice after my father fell ill. I had spent years believing that my quiet surrender of ambition was a gift to our family, a necessary sacrifice that laid the foundation for Julian to build his reputation and secure our financial future. My father had built a substantial property portfolio over 40 years, a collection of historic residential buildings and commercial spaces across the home counties that generated significant long-term yield. When his health began to fail 2 years ago, he placed his complete trust in Julian to manage the administrative transition of the estate, believing that his son-in-law possessed both the professional competence and the personal integrity to safeguard the family legacy for Beatrice and me. Clara, my younger sister by 5 years, had always moved through life with an effortless charm that excused her from the burden of practical responsibility. When father passed away 6 months ago, she was distraught, leaning heavily on Julian for support and financial guidance, weeping openly during the probate meetings, while I silently absorbed the crushing weight of grief and logistics. I took comfort in how attentive Julian was to her needs, arranging her allowance from the estate funds and ensuring she never felt abandoned during such a dark time. Looking back now, the subtle shifts in our dynamic had begun long before the envelope arrived on my doormat, disguised as harmless eccentricities or minor professional stresses. Julian began spending increasingly long evenings at the office, claiming that the restructuring of father's estate required complex tax navigation and endless consultations with private auditors. He would return home past midnight, smelling faintly of fine dining and expensive spirits, kissing my hair with a distantly affectionate routine before slipping into his study to lock away his leather briefcase. Meanwhile, Clara's presence in our lives became strangely ubiquitous, yet evasive. She would visit our home while Julian was away, asking probing questions about the exact terms of father's will, expressing sudden interest in land registry deeds, corporate holding companies, and the specific valuation of the commercial properties. Whenever I tried to join the conversations about father's legacy, Julian would gently pat my knee with a condescending smile, telling me that I shouldn't stress my mind with tedious legal jargon when he had everything under control. He convinced me to sign several power of attorney documents under the pretense of streamlining property maintenance approvals, assuring me that my signature was merely a formality to protect our tax position. I trusted him without hesitation because he was my husband, the man who had stood by my side at my father's bedside and promised to protect us. I ignored the odd discrepancies that began appearing in our joint bank statements, such as large cash withdrawals tagged as administrative fees and substantial monthly transfers to shell entities I did not recognize. Whenever I brought up these anomalies, Julian brushed them off as standard management expenses associated with maintaining high-end real estate. The distance between us widened into a quiet gulf, filled with unspoken tension and subtle dismissals that left me doubting my own instincts. Clara stopped calling me for lunch or advice, communicating instead directly through Julian under the guise of handling her allowance paperwork. 2 weeks ago, I found a receipt from a high-end jeweler in Mayfair hidden in Julian's coat pocket for a diamond tennis bracelet that I had never seen or received. When I confronted him, he laughed effortlessly, claiming it was a client appreciation gift purchased on behalf of his firm for a wealthy overseas investor's wife. I swallowed the lie because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate, choosing instead to believe in the integrity of the life we had built together over 14 years. Yesterday evening, Julian announced over dinner that he had to travel to Edinburgh for an emergency meeting regarding a major corporate takeover, packing his luxury weekend bag with practiced precision. He kissed my forehead with the same practiced warmth he had used for years, telling me to approve the final tuition wire transfer for Beatrice's private school before he left for the station. But he did not go to Scotland. The footage on the USB drive proved he was less than 10 miles away at the Obsidian Gable, sitting shoulder to shoulder with Clara in a private dining room, methodically reviewing the very property deeds my father had spent his entire lifetime accumulating. They were laughing together, whispering over documents that bore my forged or manipulated signatures, preparing to finalize a transfer that would strip me of my rightful inheritance and leave me with nothing. Sitting alone at the kitchen table as the rain drummed against the glass, the fog of denial finally cleared to reveal a cold, terrifying reality. The man I had loved and the sister I had protected were actively dismantling my life behind closed doors while treating me like a naive bystander in my own home. I pulled up my laptop screen once more, opening our private family trust portal to check the status of the master deeds, only to find that my administrative access had been quietly revoked 3 days ago. My hands were perfectly steady now as the initial shock transformed into a sharp, icy clarity that I had not felt in years. The text message from the unknown sender still glowed on my phone screen, confirming that Julian and Clara were returning to the Obsidian Gable tonight at 9 o'clock to execute the final transfer papers. I spent the afternoon sitting in the silence of my study, sifting through years of filed tax documents, bank statements, and personal correspondence that I had blindly accepted as genuine. Every document Julian had ever asked me to sign passed through my mind with frightening clarity, now viewed through a lens stripped of trust. I opened my personal secure cloud storage, where I had routinely backed up scanned copies of my father's original handwritten estate intentions before his health deteriorated. The discrepancies between his original wishes and the revised trust structure were stark, revealing a deliberate multi-year paper trail designed to siphon capital away from my name and into an offshore holding company registered in the Channel Islands. By 7 o'clock, the rain had settled into a heavy, relentless downpour that drummed against the roof of my vehicle as I parked 3 streets away from the discreet rear entrance of the Obsidian Gable. The exclusive establishment was tucked away behind high stone walls and dense greenery, catering to wealthy patrons who valued absolute discretion above all else. I wore a dark trench coat, slipping the brass key numbered 04 deep into my pocket alongside my mobile phone, which was set to silent. My heart pounded heavily against my ribs, yet my mind remained strangely calm and clear, detached from the emotional storm that had threatened to consume me hours earlier. Walking through the side gate, I used the brass key to unlock a heavy timber door that led into a narrow, dimly lit service corridor reserved for private staff. The air smelled of polished mahogany, old wine, and expensive cigars as I navigated the carpeted hallway toward the hidden stairwell that led to the upper viewing galleries. Key 04 smoothly unlocked the padded door of the observation booth overlooking VIP Room 2, allowing me to step into a small, dark room equipped with a tinted one-way glass panel looking directly down onto the dining table below. Through the glass, I saw Julian sitting at the head of the polished table, immaculately dressed in his navy-tailored suit, sipping a glass of aged scotch while tapping his fingers impatiently on a leather folder. A few moments later, the door below opened, and Clara walked in, wearing a striking emerald silk dress that our mother had given her years ago. She carried a thin leather briefcase, sat down directly across from Julian, and offered him a tense, nervous smile that lacked her usual carefree warmth. I leaned closer to the concealed brass speaker vent mounted on the wall, listening as their voices rose clearly into the silent observation space. Clara opened the briefcase and slid a stack of legal documents across the table, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. She expressed hesitation, asking Julian if they were moving too fast and whether Eleanor might notice the final capital transfer before the end of the month. Julian let out a low, condescending chuckle, reaching across the table to cover her hand with his in a gesture that made my stomach churn. He assured her that I was completely oblivious, calling me naive and overly trusting, reminding her that I had signed the master authorization forms without reading a single clause. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to English Stories Hub. A simple like helps more people discover these stories, and your support inspires us to create new ones. Now, let's continue. Julian opened the folder and pointed to a specific signature page, explaining that once Clara placed her signature alongside his as co-trustee, the remaining 60% of my father's commercial property empire would be legally reclassified as corporate assets under their joint holding entity. Clara took a silver fountain pen from her bag, but instead of signing immediately, she hesitated, asking Julian about the personal guarantees he had promised regarding her offshore accounts and the property in France. It was at that moment I noticed a subtle shift in Julian's posture, a cold, calculating flicker in his eyes that Clara was too anxious to see. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a separate set of papers that had not been part of the original package, sliding them under the main agreement. Through the glass, my legal background allowed me to recognize the distinct formatting of a personal indemnity waiver and a debt assignment deed. Julian was not just helping Clara take my inheritance, he was actively structuring the transfer so that all legal liabilities and potential tax fraud charges would fall entirely on Clara's shoulders if the authorities ever audited the trust. A quiet tap on the door behind me made me freeze in the darkness of the gallery. I turned slowly as the door opened, revealing a tall, sharply dressed man in a dark charcoal suit, holding a master key card. He looked at me with an expression of calm, professional neutrality, holding up a sleek black tablet that displayed a real-time audio feed of the room below. He introduced himself in a low whisper as the head of security for the club, explaining that he was the person who had sent the envelope to my home that morning. He quietly informed me that Julian had been using the club's private facilities for months to conduct illegal financial transactions, violating the establishment's strict policies, and that the club management was preparing to hand full surveillance records over to the Serious Fraud Office. The head of security offered a faint, solemn nod before quietly retreating into the shadowy corridor, leaving the door unlocked behind him. Down below, unaware of the quiet revelation unfolding above them, Julian smoothly slid the silver fountain pen into Clara's trembling fingers, gently urging her toward the dotted signature line. My fingers tightened around the velvet curtain frame as I watched my own sister hover on the brink of signing away her freedom to a man who viewed her as nothing more than a convenient scapegoat. The realization hit me with crystalline certainty. Julian had executed a masterclass in double manipulation, using Clara's greed to strip me of my rightful heritage, while subtly setting her up to bear the entirety of the criminal fallout. I remained still in the darkness, allowing my mobile phone to record every syllable flowing through the brass speaker vent. Clara cleared her throat, her voice wavering slightly, as she asked Julian once more whether the offshore transfers were fully protected from any future forensic audits. Julian laughed, a dry, dismissive sound that echoed coldly against the mahogany-paneled walls of the private suite. He reassured her with calculated warmth, claiming that my complete lack of financial vigilance ensured that no one would ever investigate the shifting asset balances. Every word he uttered was a brutal testament to his absolute contempt for both of us, proving that 14 years of marriage had meant nothing to him beyond a convenient veil for his financial ambitions. Clara raised the pen and pressed its nib against the fine parchment, signing the first 3 copies of the transfer deeds with quick, nervous strokes. As she reached the final page, the very debt assignment deed that quietly shifted millions in fraudulent liabilities onto her personal name, she suddenly paused, noticing a clause that had not been present in the draft copies Julian had emailed her the previous week. She looked up, her expression turning sharp with suspicion, as she asked him why her personal guarantee was linked directly to the primary mortgage indemnities of the commercial properties. Julian's affectionate demeanor dissolved instantly, replaced by a cold, hardened stare that I had never seen him direct toward anyone outside a courtroom. He leaned forward across the table, speaking in a low, dangerous tone that warned her not to question his expertise at the 11th hour. He reminded her that she was already deep within the illegal framework of the transfer, and that backing out now would leave her exposed to massive civil liability without his firm's legal protection. Clara's face drained of color as the truth began to pierce through her denial, realizing that the trap Julian had built was closing in around her just as tightly as it had around me. Instead of retreating into panic, a quiet, resolute strength settled within me, replacing the remnant aches of betrayal with absolute tactical clarity. I reached into my trench coat pocket, pulled out my phone, and opened our secure joint banking application, utilizing the recovery protocol codes I had retrieved from my father's old filing cabinet earlier that afternoon. Because Julian had neglected to officially remove my name as a primary guarantor on the master corporate accounts, relying instead on my compliance, I still possessed the ultimate administrative authority to freeze all pending outbound wires. With 3 deliberate taps on the screen, I locked every corporate ledger associated with my father's estate, effectively trapping Julian's liquid capital in an immediate compliance freeze. Down below, Julian's phone buzzed sharply against the polished wood table. He picked it up with an irritated frown, expecting a routine update from his firm. But as his eyes scanned the screen, his composure visibly shattered. The color drained from his face as a red warning notification flashed across his device, indicating that all major asset accounts under the Vane Family Trust had been flagged for suspicious activity and placed under immediate administrative lock. He leapt to his feet, knocking his crystal glass of scotch onto the velvet rug, frantically trying to log into his master portal, only to find himself completely locked out. Clara stared at him in horror, rising from her chair as the atmosphere in the private suite collapsed into panic. Julian began swearing under his breath, pacing the length of the room while desperately speed-dialing his chief financial manager, completely unaware that I was already stepping out of the viewing gallery and descending the carpeted staircase toward VIP Room 2. I gripped the heavy brass handle of the suite's timber door, pushed it open, and stepped into the room, locking eyes with my husband and my sister as the final illusion of their flawless plan crumbled into dust. The sudden click of the lock turning in the door made both Julian and Clara freeze. As I stepped into the warm, amber light of the private suite, the silence that followed was suffocating. Clara gasped, dropping her silver fountain pen onto the carpet, while Julian stood motionless near the table, his phone still pressed to his ear and his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fury. I walked calmly toward the head of the mahogany table, my wet trench coat dripping onto the polished floorboards, and pulled out a chair directly across from them. Julian recovered his speech first, his expression morphing from panic into a practiced mask of condescending concern as he took a step toward me. He asked what on earth I was doing there, using the same gentle, patronizing tone he had relied on for 14 years to make me feel small. He claimed that this was an internal corporate matter regarding Clara's allowance and urged me to go home, promising that we would discuss his cancelled Edinburgh trip in the morning. I stared at him without a single flicker of emotion, opened my handbag, and placed my phone in the center of the table, where the live recording app was still silently capturing every word. I turned my gaze to Clara, whose face had gone entirely pale as she looked between Julian and me. I picked up the stack of legal deeds from the table and slowly flipped to the final page. The very debt assignment deed Julian had cleverly disguised beneath the primary transfer documents. I slid the paper directly in front of my sister and pointed to the indemnification clause, explaining in a quiet, steady voice that while she believed she was signing her way to half of our father's estate, she was actually taking full legal liability for £3 million in fraudulent offshore loans Julian had taken out in her name. Clara's eyes darted across the fine legal print, her mouth opening in silent horror as the legal reality sank in. She looked up at Julian, her voice cracking as she demanded to know if what I said was true. Julian snapped, dropping all pretense of charm as he slammed his hand onto the mahogany table, telling her to shut up and accusing her of being an ungrateful child. In that single, ugly outburst, the refined, dignified man he had presented to the world vanished completely, leaving behind a desperate, greedy fraud who was watching his empire collapse in real time. I picked up my phone and opened the master financial ledger, displaying the red freeze notice across the screen before showing it to Julian. I informed him that 40 minutes ago, using my full administrative authority as primary co-trustee, I had transferred every piece of evidence, including the hidden camera footage, the altered deeds, and the recorded conversations, directly to the head of compliance at his firm and the Serious Fraud Office. Julian's breath hitched in his throat, his face turning a ghostly gray as he realized that the freeze on the accounts was not a technical glitch, but the permanent shutdown of his entire career and freedom. Clara burst into tears, sinking into her chair and burying her face in her hands, desperately begging for my forgiveness and claiming that Julian had manipulated her from the very beginning. I looked at my younger sister with a mixture of sadness and firm resolve, telling her that while I would not let her go to prison for Julian's crimes, she would be returning every penny of her advance, relinquishing her co-trustee rights, and facing the consequences of her own choices. I gathered the original deeds from the table, placed them securely inside my handbag, and stood up, looking down at the two people who had spent months plotting my destruction. Julian took a desperate step forward, his voice breaking as he tried to grab my arm, pleading with me to think of our family, our social standing, and our daughter's future. I stepped back, cutting him off with a look so cold that he instantly dropped his hand, and told him that Beatrice would grow up knowing a mother who fought for justice rather than a father who built a life on deceit. I turned on my heel and walked out of the private suite, leaving Julian staring into the abyss of his own undoing while Clara's quiet sobs echoed down the corridor behind me. The heavy timber doors of the Obsidian Gable swung shut behind me, sealing away the panicked whispers and broken promises of the room I had just left. The cool autumn air washed over my face, carrying the sharp scent of damp earth and pine, and for the first time in 14 years, I took a deep, unrestricted breath. As I walked down the gravel path toward my car, the quiet rain felt less like a storm and more like a necessary cleansing, washing away the lingering traces of a life built on silence, surrender, and misplaced trust. In the weeks that followed, the collapse of Julian's carefully constructed world was swift, precise, and entirely of his own making. The evidence I submitted to the Serious Fraud Office and the Senior Board of Vane and Sterling initiated a comprehensive forensic audit that uncovered years of systematically hidden liabilities, unauthorized offshore transfers, and attempted document falsifications. Within 48 hours of our confrontation in the private suite, Julian was formally suspended from his firm, his corporate credentials revoked, and his name removed from the partnership board. Face to face with indisputable digital and financial records, his legal counsel advised him against contesting the divorce proceedings, allowing us to finalize a swift, comprehensive settlement that preserved my father's property empire entirely for Beatrice's future, while stripping Julian of any claim to our estate. Clara, stripped of the illusions Julian had spun around her, faced her own quiet reckoning, while my legal team ensured she was spared criminal prosecution due to her cooperation with the authorities and her ultimate refusal to sign the final debt assignment deed. The cost to her life was absolute. She signed a binding legal agreement relinquishing all trustee authority, agreeing to a court-monitored repayment structure for the funds she had improperly drawn from the estate. Our relationship as sisters, once rooted in shared memories and unquestioned loyalty, was fundamentally altered. We do not speak of forgiveness or reconciliation, but of boundaries and accountability. She has moved to a small town in Yorkshire, quietly rebuilding a life far removed from the wealth and influence she had so recklessly tried to claim. The true victory, however, was not measured in court orders, frozen bank accounts, or corporate downfall. It was found in the quiet stillness of my study on a bright spring morning, 6 months after that fateful Tuesday. As I sat at my desk reviewing the restored master deeds of my father's properties, I realized that the woman who had spent years doubting her own instincts, shrinking her voice to maintain peace, and signing away her autonomy, had completely vanished. In her place stood someone who understood that dignity is not given, but claimed, and that protecting one's integrity requires unwavering strength rather than quiet endurance. When Beatrice returned home from school that afternoon, laughing as she ran through the garden toward the bright, open kitchen, I watched her with a peaceful, settled heart. The house was no longer a stage for performance or a prison of polite deceit, but a home grounded in truth, security, and genuine freedom. I walked to the window, watching the sunlight bounce off the quiet glass of the patio doors, knowing with absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, I would face them standing tall, guided entirely by my own strength and governed by my own truth. Thank you for spending your time with us. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment and let us know what you thought. We'd also love to hear what kind of stories you'd like to listen to next. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and subscribe to English Stories Hub. A new story is coming soon, and we can't wait to share it with you. Thank you for your support, your comments, and for being part of our community. Until next time, take care and keep the stories alive.